Good evening. Oh my God, it's so great to see you. Yoo-hoo! Welcome back, yay! Oh, this is really a delight. I'm so happy to see you all here. And I know I've missed you. I know you've missed us, not me, us. And I know, unfortunately, you'll miss tonight our bad wine and our soggy, truffle popcorns because COVID regulations don't allow us to have a reception yet, but we'll get there, so hang in there. In the meantime, we'll all be here in this theater that we love so much, the Bartos Theater, to reprise the R&D Salon that we have abandoned in February of 2020, because we refused to make them, to have them on Zoom, just because, it's so much better to all be here together and speak. So, tonight, we reprise the R&D salons that, as you know, were invented a few years ago to prove to people that museums and cultural institutions can be the R&D of society, that we don't only show art on walls, but we also help people find in themselves the kind of slow and dependable progress that we all need as a society in order to move forward. And tonight, we're going to talk about something really important when it comes to how to move forward. How shall we move forward? Should we hope for a renaissance or should we enact a revolution of sorts? This is the theme for tonight, and it's a really very, very heavy and intense night with great presenters. And differently from usual, I would like to start the evening with a video. You know that we have presenters and then we also have some video interventions. And I would like to have the first video by Patrick Wyman playing. Patrick is the author of The Verge, which is a book on the Renaissance and on how it changed the world in a few years. And he's also a podcast author. He actually has podcasts about history. So let me start with Patrick's video, please.
The key distinction between a revolution and a renaissance is how they justify themselves, by looking either forward or backward. A revolution looks forward to an idealized future. The sense of newness and possibility is what drives the enterprise onward. A renaissance, by contrast, looks to an idealized past. Things were better then, in that fuzzy and selectively defined age, and only by embracing the practices and mores of that idealized past can a better future be born. When we consider the European Renaissance, this emphasis on the past is an overlooked component. The scholars and politicians who drove it onward wanted to improve their world, but they distrusted the idea of novelty. Even the most radical ideas had to be justified by reference to the practices of Greco-Roman antiquity, which they saw as the font of everything good and proper. Language, architecture, rhetoric, the idea of a citizen's role in a republic, no matter how adapted the prescriptions were for their world of the 14th or 15th century, they drew their power from their association with an idealized past. The past can be a source of inspiration, but it's also dangerous precisely because it contains multitudes. Whose past are we talking about, and whose understanding of that past? What ideas is it being deployed to justify in the present? The exalted figures of the Renaissance were picking and choosing, not based on some objective standard of aesthetics or quality, but because it rhymed with their own worldview and needs. One person's imagined golden age and source of everything good and admirable is another's hell. A Florentine scholar-politician saw much more of himself in Cicero than in an enslaved stonecutter in a marble quarry, for example. A renaissance is an idealized thing. It's a justification for changes in the present built on a selective understanding of the past. We can't forget the justification, the selection, or the idealization. They're the foundations of a renaissance, and we should be wary of them.
Upon this very clear distinction between revolution and renaissance hovers the shadow of money. And actually, the way in which this salon came to be was through a friend, Hadil Ibrahim, who spoke to me about a book about the Medicis and their power by Tim Parks. And that book got me thinking, especially during the pandemic, about the role that the elites and the philanthrocapitalists are having in our society these days. They're trying to think of how we should move forward, but at the same time they want, as our friend Anna Girdaras also speculates, they want to preserve the status quo. So we need to be very much aware of how we move forward towards our future now that we're coming back from this epochal shock that was the pandemic. This mural that you see here is Diego Rivera's. You might remember it. It's Man at the Crossroads from 1934. It's the mural that was painted at Rockefeller Center, but that was destroyed because the Rockefellers were not very comfortable with Lenin and other depictions. And therefore, it was then remade by Rivera in Mexico. But so, it goes without saying that the adage says that after every big crisis comes a renaissance, that usually that historically curbed inequality comes after catastrophes. That's what is speculated to have started the Renaissance, the 14th century plague all over Europe, the Black Death, or also the 1918 flu pandemic, and the Roaring Twenties and the Renaissance of this side. And it is speculated that there will be, or people have talked about, a Renaissance after the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't know if that's going to happen, but for sure we have some pretty amazing problems that are lingering or that have underlined everything that we've gone through in these past 2 years. Of course, there's an incredibly important environmental emergency that is very well interconnected with every other emergency. There's a labor crisis. Here I'm showing you some examples of protests and revolt, and we don't want to actually confuse revolution with revolt, but it's important to see what the symptoms can be of a deeper movement. Or also the lying flat movement in China that is also about labor and about economy. Of course, we have amazingly important racial tensions that are going on and are manifested not only in the Black Lives Movement and in the police violence protests, but also in the voting rights attacks that are happening. All over the world there are protests happening, I'm showing here Bolsonaro, and also I would like to ask our speakers tonight what they think January 6th was, but it's interesting to see all of these different tensions that are coming to the surface and that we have to deal with now that we're trying to come out of the pandemic. So we are at the crossroads, not men, but humans at the crossroads, and we need to decide how we want to take care of our future and how we want to let that happen. Now, the European Renaissance is a construct from the 19th century, especially Jakob Burckhardt spoke about these years of splendor that happened after the Black Plague, but in truth, it's a much more composite and multi-layered series of decades that changed in the structures of power and how they subsequently moved. But of course, this is the image that we have of the Renaissance. It started with Cosimo de' Medici, at least in Florence, and then it kind of culminated with Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was the patron of so many great artists. And of course, when we think of architecture, we think of Brunelleschi and Bramante. I'm being very parochial here, because being Italian, it's kind of easier for me to talk about the Renaissance in Italy, but there are many other Renaissances, of course. And Leonardo da Vinci has become the epitome and the beginning of every platitude about Renaissance men and women and people. So there is this idealized image that we have of the Renaissance that we keep on bringing up at every turn of events in our history. And indeed, one thing that is very important to understand is how structures of power that were also fueled by money came into being. So Tim Parks writes, in return for his cash, the banker would be allowed to display his piety and power and superior aesthetic taste. Remind you of anything? The church would pretend that all this beauty was exclusively for the glory of God. Without such dishonesty, the world would be a duller place. Many centuries later, what's duller? I mean, certainly, but going forward, what do we want to do with that? Do we want to have another Renaissance of this kind in which the elites decide not only aesthetically, but also ethically, functionally, environmentally what's good for us? And do we want to move in that direction? In truth, there's been many different ways in which money has become enmeshed with the revolutions and the Renaissances, and in which revolutions have gone forward. The birth of I have such a hard time saying philanthrocapitalism. I'll say it the Italian way. Philanthrocapitalism is something that we've seen happen. Well, it has been defined only recently, but it's happened throughout history. The Medicis are the ancestors of Elon Musk and Andrew Carnegie. And in a way, we are waiting to see what happens, but we should actually be more wary, because things such as the billionaire's mega dorm, the friend of Warren Buffett that did that terrible dormitory at UC Santa Barbara. I don't even remember his name right now, but that's what we don't want to have happen, and much more than that. There's a darker side to any kind of Renaissance. I mean, the Renaissance in a way sparked also colonialism, and it sparked what is coloniality, which is much more pernicious even than colonialism. So the idea of decolonizing is political and historical, but decoloniality is something that is still in the process of happening, and that might take centuries. So dismantling structures of power is complicated and takes more systemic action. I love this Professor Walter Mignolo, who is a semiotician. The failure of decolonization during the Cold War was due mainly to the fact that the decolonization did not question the terms of the conversation. That is, did not question the structures of knowledge and subject formation, desires, beliefs, expectations that were implanted in the colonies by the former colonizers. It's still in our DNA. It's going to take a long time, and it's connected to all other crises, including the environmental one. Artists and revolutions, this is still the Museum of Modern Art, and these salons always bring back the discourse to art and what museums can do for you and for society. And artists have an incredibly important role to play in revolutions and to commenting on revolutions. Siqueiros' collective suicides from 1936 meant to bring back the memory of the campesinos that killed themselves when the conquistadores arrived from Spain, so as not to fall under their power. And Siqueiros brought it back during the Mexican War to kind of give force and energy to the warriors. Constantine Yuon, New Planet for the Soviet Revolution, La Prise de la Bastille, of course, the French Revolution that we'll hear about later, that is the mother of all revolutions, at least in the Western world, and there's also other revolutions. So artists have had a way to comment and sometimes to incite the revolution. Tonight we'll hear from Tania Bruguera, who is trying to enact a revolution within the revolution and more, but this is a piece by Tania, performance from 2009, Tatlin's Whisper, that she enacted first in Havana, and then she brought to the United States, where it was acquired by the Guggenheim, in which people would have a safe space to speak at the microphone and say whatever they wanted about the regime in Cuba, and they would carry a white dove on their shoulder, the way Fidel Castro used to in a famous speech. So commentary on the revolution, being the conscience of the revolution, or sometimes even imagining and reimagining revolutions. We see here Jacob Lawrence and his portrayal of General Toussaint Louverture, of the famous Haitian Revolution, that until recently was always depicted in a way that still was not truly giving credit to the Haitians and Toussaint in particular for the epochal change that they had brought to being. Or Emory Douglas in the African American Solidarity with the Oppressed People of the World, so revolutions that reverberate in the world. Childish Gambino, This is America, that was inspired by Arthur Jafa. Love is the message is death, and the idea of showing why we might want to have a revolution. And last but not least, also Dred Scott, artist whose name comes from Dred Scott, who is the enslaved man to whom the Supreme Court did not give rights that he deserved, and that is credited for igniting the American Civil War. So there are different ways for artists to be involved in revolutions. And last but not least, the important role that citizens have to play and that institutions have to play. And we'll hear tonight from David Wallace Wells, who will tell us about the enormous effort that is needed for us to deal with environmental crisis and emergency. So here are the speakers for tonight. We'll have Anand Girdaras, who is the author of Winners Take All. Is Winners Take All? Yeah, sorry, sometimes Winners Take All, the wonderful book that talks about the billionaires, capitalists, philanthropists, and how the elites sometimes really should be put in their place, if not more. David Wallace Wells, the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, one of the most striking and shocking and important books of the past decade about the environmental crisis, and of many more articles, essays, and books. Robin Spencer, who's a historian that specialized in the history of the feminists within the Black Panther movement. She's here in New York at CUNY. We talked about Tanya, and last but not least, Paul Friedland, a historian of the French and Atlantic French Revolution. So it's going to be quite a wonderful lineup. We also have video contributions from Hilary Cottam, Walter Mignolo, he of the Decoloniality quote that you've heard before, Tim Parks, he of Medici Money, Dred Scott, you've heard about him too, and Patrick, you've already heard from. So intense. And then there's going to be you. So with that, I am going to go on to the next video. To the next video, which is Tim, please. Tim Parks.
With usura, wrote Ezra Pound, hath no man a painted paradise on his church wall, as much as to say, money and art can't go together. Well, he was wrong. In 1436, the banker Cosimo de' Medici told Pope Eugene IV he feared he had sinned. What could he do that God might show mercy on him? Spend 10,000 florins to restore the convent of San Marco, Pope Eugene suggested. A fortune. The sin that Cosimo feared was usury, lending money at an interest, money copulating with money, the world made countable and digital. It was a sin, and it had no place in the medieval hierarchy of trades where work was visible and honorable. Cosimo de' Medici experimented with using the countable, money, to buy value that was uncountable: beauty, prestige, redemption. The banker would be made visible and respectable through art. He employed the best architects and the best painters to make the hitherto austere sacred space gracious and colourful, with Madonnas and Magi wearing the kinds of luxury clothes that a moneyed man could feel comfortable with. So the Florentine Renaissance was the result of a negotiation. It was important that the church condemned usury. It was important that the bankers worried about their souls. It was important to find painters who could fuse devotion and sensuality. You could never have planned such a fruitful exchange, such an ambiguous exchange. You could never have set up a conference of well-meaning intellectuals to figure out the way forward. But when you see something interesting beginning to happen, you can encourage it and you can run with it. And that was Cosimo de' Medici's genius.
Anand. Good segue, right? Please, your turn.
I feel I should always be preceded by a man in tweed defending plutocratic reputation laundering. It's a great intro. Thank you to the irrepressible Paola and to MoMA for bringing back IRL gathering. There's no more prestigious institution where I'd rather attend a super spreader event. No one I'd rather get COVID from than curious souls like you. So I've been thinking about these two words, as we all have, Renaissance and revolution. Renaissance means rebirth, revolution. It's the turning of the wheel, means turning things upside down. And perhaps in other times, in other places, Renaissance, rebirth, was possible without revolutionary political change. But I don't think we have the luxury of living in such a time right now, or such a place. On question after question that haunts our public life, the possibility of rebirth is threatened by those who cling. We could not only fight climate change, as David's going to talk about, and by the way, how unambitious a goal is it to simply stop ruining your home? We could actually affirmatively give birth to a global society that lives in harmony with nature and justly and sustainably with one another. But any such renaissance is threatened by clingers, by the fossil fuel companies and other actors and their protectors who would rather burn the world than lose their riches. We could build an America in which every child and every adult of every color and every origin, every faith and nature and sexuality could breathe, could rise, could thrive without fear, could be free. But any such renaissance is threatened by the clingers to white supremacy, male supremacy, and all the other chauvinisms, who would rather break our country, would rather break democracy than share it. We could have an economic renaissance. We could build a society in which we just have nice things, which is really what's at stake, in which our abundant wealth is shared and flourishing is distributed, dignity is distributed on a scale unseen in human history. But any such renaissance is threatened by the clingers to plutocracy, who would rather break your back than pay their back taxes. So I'm not sure there is any renaissance today without political, democratic revolution. I should say that throughout this pandemic, I have felt the obvious, overwhelming despair everybody else has, but I've also been unable to suppress a certain burning hope on these questions. And my hope is that people have begun to see even more clearly all the birthing and rebirthing that could happen, and all the models and ideas that need to die. My hope is that with the shock of these many months, almost 2 years, people begin to see the very real possibility of a new kind of relationship to our health and to the planet, a new kind of pluralism in this country made of the world, a new kind of economy in which we could actually center what is good for people instead of what is good for that copulating money. I feel that hope amid the obvious despair because it is precisely, as Paola said, in crisis like this, that the impossible at least becomes possible. People surrender their illusions. People give themselves space to rethink these things. But for any of these rebirths to happen, for that larger rebirth they would form together, there must be real change, revolutionary change, I would say. And real change involves the loss of power. It isn't a win-win. It isn't brought to you by consultants bearing PowerPoints. It isn't double bottom line investing or Starbucks purportedly fighting the racial wealth gap while busting unions in which actual black people are trying to organize. And it's never something the powerful voluntarily sign up for, which is why we have that thing called democracy. There is a reason they are coming for that too now, because they know that if they take democracy away, they take away the womb that has the power to gestate every other rebirth. For the last couple of years, I've been thinking and writing about the question of what stands in the way of change like this. And one obvious answer, which I traced in the earlier book Paola mentioned, is the power of the clingers, their immense wealth and power. But there's another thing too. Those of us who want real change, who want revolutionary change even, I think sometimes we talk too much about the revolutionary turning that we seek, what we seek to turn upside down, and too little about the rebirth that we picture on the other side. We talk about the process, not the outcome. We talk about the policy idea, or worse still, the name of the congressional procedure involved, not what life would be like on the other side of our visions. We talk about the terrible people we are against and their orangeness, not the people we're for, not the world we're for. For there to be revolutionary changes in our time, I think we need to do a better job of painting a picture of rebirth, of helping people see what we seek, of helping those older white people who resent a changing country, those coal miners in West Virginia who wonder what a habitable earth means for them, those worried for their 401k if an equitable society were to come, of everyone, helping everyone, including our skeptics, see who they would be, who we all would be on the far side of the mountain. None of the rebirths that I long for, my children's sake, will happen without turning things upside down, without revolutionary turning. But I'm not sure those changes will come if we don't learn to do a better job of telling people not only what we want to turn upside down, but also what we want to see, how we want to live, what we want life to feel and taste and smell like when we win. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you for a wonderful speech, Anand. And now there's a video by Hilary Cottam. Hilary is a really interesting author and writer out of the UK. She wrote Radical Help and also Revolution 5.0, a social manifesto, and actually the link is in your reading list. So please.
We've learnt that trees stand tall and beautiful the more that they can entwine their roots with one another. And more we're understanding that we humans are just the same. The more that we can care for one another, the stronger that we can stand. But although this was understood for generations, for millennia really, in the 19th century, along came that rapscallion Homo economicus. And we were told that the more we maximised our individual material gain, the stronger we'd be. And in this model, we outsourced care. We put it somewhere else where we couldn't see it, and it fell mainly on women, and in particular on Black and brown women. But in this century, millions of us are seeking different ways to live. We want to put value above pure economics. It's a plastic moment when we can rethink the design code, when we can rethink care as an art and a craft. And I think in this century, where the kind of strongest story is the technology revolution, that care will be like engineering was in the last, because we know that the work of this century is work of repair of ourselves, our bodies, of each other, and of the fragile ecosystems on which we all depend. So I think we're going to reinvent care in profound ways, which means that we all want to embrace it, value it, and see it as part of our lives. And I think that would be both a renaissance and a revolution.
And now I would like to call Paul Friedland, a professor of political and cultural history at Cornell University.
Hi. When Paola asked me to give the talk today, I said I'd be delighted. And then when I found out it was a 7-minute talk, I was like, what? I don't think historians can give a 7-minute talk, but I'm going to try. I might go 8. So I just want to, how do I move these forward? Do I just press the green button? The big green arrow. Got it. All right. So on the screen, you see 3 quotes. No time to read them. You'll just have to take my word for it. Each one of those quotes basically expresses the idea that the past weighs very heavily on the present, and not always in a way that we're conscious of. So let me give you a concrete example. You heard Patrick talking about revolution and the meaning of revolution. I'm going to give you a slightly different meaning. That before the 18th century, revolution usually meant a kind of revolving, a return to an original place, like the planets in revolution. And only really in the 18th century did the idea of revolution come to mean primarily a break with the past, toward something else. In fact, the whole idea that we're supposed to be progressing toward something is an Enlightenment idea. The best example of this way of thinking is this text by Condorcet, in which he spoke about grand revolutions of the human race, and where the word progress appears more than 170 times. So you can see the questions that we're asking in the Salon today. We are children of the Enlightenment. This could have been written by Condorcet almost word for word. So the Enlightenment invents this idea that the future is supposed to be better than the present. The Enlightenment is why we're so convinced that GDP needs to increase every year over the previous year, or maybe why your iPhone, the new iPhone is so much better than the last one. But since the question for today seemed to gesture toward the political, and since I'm a French Revolutionary historian, I thought I would spend the few minutes remaining to me talking about the French Revolution and the Atlantic Revolution. What's that?
I'll give you 2 extra minutes.
You got it. 2 minutes I can do. All right. So I am sure you are all familiar with the buzzwords of the French Revolution. And the terror and the guillotine aside, most of us have a general sense of how the French and the American revolutions helped to usher in the age of democratic revolution and the age of human rights. The French are often reminding us that they were the first to institute universal manhood suffrage, which they did, and the first to abolish slavery, which they also did in 1794. So here's an image of French Republicans celebrating the abolition of slavery in 1794, and here they are celebrating again in 1848. So what is not to like in all of this? Well, I'm going to give you a very brief narrative of the French Revolution that reveals something very different, not only about them, but about us. So in 1789, when the revolution started, everybody thought that they were living through a renaissance rather than the revolution. They thought they were restoring the ancient representative body of France, the Estates General, which had not been allowed to meet since 1614 because absolutist kings had basically said, we don't need a representative body, we are the representative body. But in 1789, absolutism was over, and they thought they were resurrecting the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. Now, bear with me for just 30 seconds. We're going to go into the weeds. I promise we're going to come out. I want to describe to you how the national representative body worked before the revolution, back in 1614 and earlier. Because nobody voted for anybody. Instead, they would gather together at the local level, and they would draw up a notebook. They would sit there for weeks drawing up a notebook. And then they would pick someone, or maybe a few people, to take that notebook to the regional level. And there, all of the people from the region would gather together. They would edit that notebook, and they would come up with one regional notebook. They'd send that on to the national meeting of the Estates General, where they would edit all of the regional notebooks into one huge notebook which represented the will of the people of the nation. You might almost think of it as government by Wikipedia. So this was the representative body that they thought they were bringing back in 1789. But that is not what happened. What happened was political events moved so quickly that the guys who showed up with their notebooks kind of pushed them to the side. And in the end, they didn't have time to check with their constituents, so they started thinking on the fly. And they started making decisions that they thought were in the best interest of their constituents. What happened, in other words, was that modern political representation was born. So when they drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man just 2 months later, you can see both forms, either personally or through their representatives. But look at this, 2 years later, Constitution of 1791, the nation from whom alone all powers emanate cannot exercise those powers except by delegation. The French Constitution is representative. No binding instructions may be given to the representatives. So what happened there? Almost under the radar, professional representatives replaced the will of the people. Where did this come from? In part, it was spontaneous. In part, maybe they were looking across the channel. This is Rousseau's critique a few decades earlier of British representation. You'll see that he says they're only free when they vote, and then they become political slaves. So much of the narrative of democracy and liberty obscures this story. And it obscures the fundamental difference between democracy and representative democracy. So why does any of this matter? Well, I promise I am not arguing that we should return to the 17th century. My point is to emphasize how one peculiar form of government, among many possibilities, a kind of genetic mutation in political practice, appeared at a moment in time and eventually spread throughout the entire world. Because look at this, UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The will of the people shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections. And this peculiar form of government comes with certain built-in consequences, which I'm sure you know. One, it makes us think that meaningful change happens at the level of government. that we should leave the thinking and the doing to professionals. It encourages sort of apathy at the local level. 2, representative government tends to encourage the development of political parties, which often fall, I don't have to tell you, into polarized, antagonistic, binary opposites, in contrast to the consensus model. And 3, the stakes of elections become so high, either you win or you lose, that the winners feel as if they have the right to push through their agenda, and the losers feel resentment and hostility. So lastly, I want to suggest that all the talk about liberty and equality, representative governments are not inherently more moral than other governments. Those slides that I showed you before, you might have wondered why 1794 and 1848, maybe the French loved abolition so much they did it twice. Well, that's exactly what happened. Because it's true that the French Republic was the first government to abolish slavery. It's also true that the French Republic was the first government to re-enslave its own free people. In 1802, France dispatched a huge armada of ships over the Caribbean to reimpose slavery on people of African descent who had lived as free citizens of the Republic for 8 years. And what happened was in Guadeloupe, Republican French forces showed up and met Republican forces of color in Guadeloupe, and they both sang the Marseillaise. They both thought they were fighting for the Republic. And in the end, Louis Delgrès, who was the leader of French Republican forces in Guadeloupe, when he saw he was going to lose, blew himself up and his followers, screaming, "Live free or die." So here are the images of the French Republic re-enslaving people. Yeah, right. There are no images of the French Republic re-enslaving people because it doesn't fit the narrative. So, as you may know, things turned out differently in Saint-Domingue, where local forces were able to resist and where they proclaimed the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. But that narrative, as Paola was saying before, was suppressed almost like the images of what happened. And it wasn't until C.L.R. James published Black Jacobins in the 1930s that we first began to hear about it outside of Haiti. And people didn't really even read it until the 1960s. And I very, very much recommend this more recent book, Probing the Silences of Historical Narratives on Haiti. Today, though, things have seemingly changed. We tend to celebrate narratives about Haiti, but I worry just a little bit about the French putting plaques in the Pantheon in Paris to both Delgrès and Toussaint Louverture, as if they were both French freedom fighters. Or this street sign in Paris, which really does not tell the story. I think something like this would be a little bit more accurate. So in short, it's very hard to keep those struggles in the Caribbean from being co-opted by the old narrative of liberty and democracy. So I am going to leave it there. I've tried as best I can in a really short time to kind of problematize the notion of past revolutions and progress. I do not mean to be pessimistic, but rather to imagine other possibilities than what the past has left us. Because to quote the inimitable Greta Thunberg at the climate conference last week, we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent. The next video is very dense, so please follow it carefully. It's Walter Mignolo, the professor from Duke University that I mentioned before, expert semiotician and expert in decoloniality. Please.
Seen from the south of the Americas and the Caribbean, there are two chronological periods in the European Renaissance. The first, 1350-1500, was an intramural European process. The second, 1500-1650, establishes the foundation for the westernization of the world that is closing today in 2021. Distinctive of this second period of the European Renaissance was the formation of a structure of domination and exploitation that is still in force today, the colonial matrix of power, although it is no longer controlled by the North Atlantic, the US, and the European Union. Created by the North Atlantic institution and actors and regulated by vernacular modern European languages, Westernization managed to create a world order grounded on political and economic unipolarity and epistemic and aesthetic universalism. This world order provoked conflicts that through 500 years of Westernization became stronger and more visible, both in the interstate system, the rise of China, the disobedience of Russia, and in the public sphere, anti-racist, gender liberation, religious sovereignty, land restitution. Today, there are two forces confronting the colonial metric of power. One is the Westernization, the other is decoloniality. De-Westernization, China, Russia, Iran, disputes the political and economic and military control of the colonial metric of power and is dissolving the previous unipolar world order into multipolarity. While decoloniality, the global political society acting in the public sphere, the links from the epistemic and aesthetic control of North Atlantic abstract universal, dissolving universality into pluriversality.
Well, I told you, but it's really important. So I would like now to call on Robin Spencer, historian, a CUNY, and an expert in Black and African American and Black protest after World War II. Robin, please.
Thank you, thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here and be part of this conversation. My focus of study is the 1960s, and I can't help but observe that the 1960s is having quite the renaissance. When we think about revolution in this country, it's oftentimes to the 1960s that we turn. The major transformations that happen in terms of the changes wrought by the women's liberation movement, the change in race relations, the war on poverty, the impact of the US war in Vietnam, African decolonization, all of that is part of the conversation when we think and talk about what does revolution mean in this country. So I wanted to center our conversation today and my remarks on the history of the Black Panther Party, because the Black Panther Party is one of the leading organizations of the movement for Black power, and in particular looking at the role that women played as part of the organization, as leaders, as thinkers, of people who were trying to put into place the very same imaginations and materiality of social change in their lives that they wanted to see in the future. So quick summary of the Black Panther Party, maybe in 1 minute or less. Okay, the Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. It grew to become one of the leading Black power organizations. Of course, many people think they know a lot about the organization, but oftentimes the organization's history has been so warped by misrepresentation of what they were about. They were an anti-capitalist organization. They were an organization that focused on social programs. They fought back against police brutality as well as taking a strong anti-war stance. Important to know that Black women were at the helm of the organization. Whatever we think we know about the organization, for sure we don't see any Black women when we imagine what the Black Panther Party was about, what it did, what it meant, what it was about. Yet it was Black women who were at the forefront. And just to quote the Lord, Audre Lorde, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. I love this quote because it speaks to the histories that are there, but that we don't know about. And the battlefields right now about history, historians, I feel like, although we are a staid group and we're oftentimes not imagined to be on the front lines of these struggles around the future of this country, historians are the ones to really speak to some of the major questions, especially history teaching right now. So Black women at the helm of the Black Panther Party were oftentimes unrecognized. When we think about the organization, these are the images that we have in mind. These images are also important to note. They're not showing anything. They're not showing any political work. They're not showing any political ideas. They're marching, they're posturing, they're images that are powerful in one way, but also flat. Well, in contrast, when we think about Black Panther Party women, we see something quite different, right? We see women who are doing things like voter registration and education, something that many people don't know that the organization took part in, but the Black Panther Party was responsible for registering thousands of people to vote, that they were speaking as spokespeople to a broad variety of allies. So the organization was also connected to people from all around the world. They had what today we would call allies from different parts of the racial spectrum. They also did public media, and they very much were focused on a holistic vision of what revolution would look like, mind, body, and soul. Revolution was not something that would come out of the pages of philosophy books, but revolution would be enacted in how you lived your life. Were you yourself addressing those issues around discrimination, around inequality, with how you lived your life, your daily choices? Not just what you believed in or signed on to, but the very real way that you lived. So Panther women, in a lot of ways, were at the helm of this kind of prefigurative politics, a politics that would embody and try to create the world, and try to create the future in the moment, right? And that's what more people need to know about the organization, especially the women. This image kind of represents some of the ways that the organization tried to meet material needs and how they politicized those desires. So providing people with food and groceries and children with breakfast before school was not just about feeding people and filling stomachs. It was about modeling what should be expected as human rights in this country. And Panther women were at the helm of that. Education. This idea of education being connected to a holistic understanding of children, understanding that children themselves have human rights, breaking down the hierarchy that was there and challenging the hierarchy between adult and child, was also something that they did as part of their political work. They really did paint a picture of this rebirth. They painted a picture of what was possible through their actions and their activities at the time. This kind of world building is so important to note, and oftentimes it's not what we expect from the history, but the history represents and has lots of evidence to show us a way forward. The Panther women in particular also focused on comradeship. In other words, how do people relate to each other? Understanding that people's ability to maintain human relationships of integrity was also part of the revolution that they sought. Revolution was not about just bare acquisition. It was not just about challenging the capitalists out there. It was about challenging the capitalists in here, in your heart. It was about treating people with respect. It was about figuring out how to work around differences. They were not always successful. It wasn't harmonious within the organization. I like to say they were like a family, and people oftentimes kind of look at that with a positive spin. But I always say, yeah, they were like a family, because families are complex, right? And people disagree, but they find a way to remain connected sometimes, or we create our own sense of family beyond the bonds of biology. Panther women's history, in a very real way, speak to the dailiness of struggle, what it meant to exist in an organization where every day, every act was something to be reconsidered and thought about. This is so important because when we think about revolution, it's always something out there. It's something we have to marshal ourselves to do, march outside and do. It's not in the house. It's not in how we speak to our children, how we address the people around us, how we deal with disagreements. And it's the dailiness of what the Panther women tried to do. the dailiness of how they sought to create social change that's just as important as how many people were registered to vote, as how many protests happened against how many police acts of violence. The Panthers' very real legacy is in the real soil that the women helped to till. Final words. Black women's history is oftentimes shuttered, right? When you think about the need for a movement like Say Her Name to focus on women's connection to and suffering from police violence, we see that it gives evidence to the fact that when we think about who's at the forefront, women are oftentimes victimized, they are victim, etc. Finally, it was really great to write a book called The Revolution Has Come that was published in 2016, because it seemed at that time that there was so much revolution in the air, so much talk of revolution and transformation. And I want to leave us with this idea of kind of breaking down the bonds between Renaissance and Revolution, thinking about how we can revisit the past as a place to go for an understanding of transformation, and thinking about revolution as something that can happen, that can be enacted in your life this very minute, in the relationships that you have, the hierarchies that you can subvert. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now I would like to call to the podium Tania Bruguera, artist.
Hi. I'm here the only person today who is the daughter of the revolution. I was born in 1968, the year of all revolutions, and I have always believed that the Cuban Revolution was what I had to follow and to be, and to be proud of. I remember the first time I came to New York, I took a taxi and the guy heard my accent and said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Cuba." He said, "You are from Cuba. My kid studied medicine in Cuba." He was an African driver, and we started talking about the relation between Cuba and Africa and the Cuban Revolution in Africa. 3 days ago, the Cuban police entered the housing of the medical school where some South African students were having a party, and it was too loud. And they started beating those students. Thank God some of them took a video and put it on the internet. Many years ago, I was very pleased to hear how Cuba helped other countries bringing doctors for free, because we had a concept called solidarity. Today, the Cuban government sells the services of the doctors to different countries, Venezuela, now Mexico, Brazil. They are paid, the Cuban government is paid around $5,000 per doctor per month, and the doctors are being paid around $300 per month. One of the issues that us, the young Cubans, want is to know where the other money is going. Because all the medical institutions in Cuba are extremely destroyed. Only the last 2 years, they have closed 3 hospitals because they were in such a bad stage that they had to close it. By the way, one of those were closed so they could build a new hotel in collaboration with China. So revolution for me is a big pain. Revolution for me is having to step up every day to talk to my leftist friend who I love and tell them Cuban revolution has died. And nobody's listening. for me, talking about revolution is painful because right now, more than 700 Cubans are in prison because they dare to go in the street on July 11 spontaneously and decide they wanted freedom. In one day, Cuba became the country with more political prisoners in the world. We had, in one day, more than 187 prisoners, just because they went in the street and said, we want freedom. It is painful because there were more than 40 underage prisoners who were actually put in grown-ups jails. It is painful because a few days ago, a father was crying on the internet saying that he could not understand that he is a revolutionary and that his kid, who is 17 years old, has been condemned to 23 years just for going to the street and scream freedom. The only way I can access Renaissance is we do the revolution within the revolution. And it is because the Cuban Revolution has become a trademark. It is not anymore a social justice movement. It is not anymore the place where you can find growth and to understand words like camarada. It is a place where you find a government doing business and taking the advantage of being in power to make better businesses for themselves. It is a place where they claim to the world that they're going to do a new constitution because they're so democratic. But when you go, like all of my friends have done, and present a paper saying the Article 56 of the Constitution say you have the right to march in peace, they say no, and they imprison half of the people who had gone legally to present a paper for permission. So it is very painful for me because right now, as we speak, we have more than 8 people who are disappeared. Today was the day in which we had decided by chance, it coincided, the 15th of November, that we were going to go and march in the streets again. And there are more than 50 activists right now who are surrounded by the police, like I was for 10 months, and who cannot get out of their houses. Some of them say, we don't care, we go out because we want to march, and these are people who we don't know where they are right now. We have several activists who are right now going to different, calling to different police stations, and nobody knows where they are. So unfortunately, the Cuban Revolution has become a lexical problem because they have taken ownership of words that belong to the people. And they actually resist any attempt that we do to recover the proper use of some of the words. Right now, we are in a process in which the Cubans have decided they want to change. It is not a sexy subject to tell you, I'm sorry. But the real revolution is not the glamorous conversation that we have over wine. It is the very hard work that we have to do every day to make sure that our compañeros are out of jail, that the rights of the people are being met, and that people like, for example, Daniela Rojo, who is the mother of 2 children and has been disappeared for 4 days, nobody knows where she is, can go back home and take care of her kids. We want a place, it's a hard work because we have hundreds of activists working and trying to have the name of everybody who is in prison, trying to bring them food, trying to bring them some medicine. And the government is calling all of us mercenaries. And they are calling us contrarrevolucionarios. I'm not sure. I think we are the revolutionaries. And I think that we need to start understanding that the Cuban Revolution is a trademark that is exported and it is profited after. And I only ask you today to, as a way to dignify the name of all the young activists in Cuba who are fighting today for social change and social justice, that we stop saying the Cuban Revolution and we start saying the revolution of the Cubans. Thanks.
Well, Tanya, thank you. So and now the video by Dred Scott, artist.
I'm Dred Scott. How do icons and iconoclasm affect a revolutionary spirit? In short, to have a revolutionary spirit, icons of the old and outmoded need to be metaphorically smashed and destroyed, and icons of the new need to be created to inspire people with visions of a radical change. I'm anti-American, and you should be too. Jesus, Gandhi, Mao Zedong, Martin Luther King, Obama, Trump are all icons. The question is not whether having these symbols or icons is bad. The question is where will following any of these icons lead? What is the content that we are inspired by? I'm anti-American, and you should be too. America is an icon, and it is a barrier to a better world. It's a country founded on slavery and genocide. Owning people was essential to the founders' ideas of democracy. Today, it is based on exploitation and oppression. Millions of people are in prison and on parole. Borders divide us, and migrants are hounded. Black people are disenfranchised. Wars for empire are waged. Women's bodies are controlled by Christian-inspired laws and courts. Inequality is enshrined. The planet's on fire, and America is fueling the climate emergency. This is America. If you're clinging to the belief that there is some sort of idealized America that can be perfected, it will blunt any revolutionary spirit you have. The icon of America needs to be buried with the past. Malcolm X said that revolutions overturn systems, revolutions destroy systems. My 2019 community-engaged performance, Slave Rebellion Reenactment, reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in U.S. history. It reenacted an uprising where rebels in 1811 had an audacious plan to overthrow the system of slavery and set up an African republic in Orleans Territory. The reenactment commingled the past and present. It smashed several icons of the past and created an icon of joyous, smiling, liberating army of armed Black and Indigenous people coming to a modern metropolitan American city. For a truly revolutionary spirit, we need a deep understanding of the problems we confront and how the world can be radically different. And as part of this, we need images and icons of that change.
Well, as a good segue, I would like to call to the podium David Wallace Wells, author.
Thank you. It's really good to be here and to be talking after all of you incredibly inspiring, brilliant speakers. So I'm here talking about climate change, but I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the two terms that everybody has been dancing around and offering perspective on, Renaissance and Revolution, and add one kind of additionally complicating perspective, which is the question of time. You know, something that you'd call a Renaissance if it unfolded over 150 years, you might call a revolution if it took place over 5 months. And maybe I think that's especially important because I come to the subject from climate, and in the climate world, timelines really are hugely, hugely important. You know, you've probably heard a lot over the last couple of years about the need to, roughly speaking, cut our emissions in half by 2030 to give us a decent chance of avoiding what was long called catastrophic warming. But it's also the case that the damage that we've already done to this point can't be undone for hundreds of thousands of years. So we're dealing with both a timeline that is incredibly short and a timeline that is unbelievably, inconceivably long. I often think all the ways that climate change is likely to throw our world and our preconceptions and meta-narratives into disarray, time may ultimately be the most profound disturbance. I think that because, as many of you in the room may know, we call them fossil fuels because they used to be fossils. Like, we are literally burning the ancient history of the planet every time we turn on our car. But it's also the case that all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity are still up there in the atmosphere. They're still burning, they're still warming the planet, which means they're not really even past emissions. They are still effectively present emissions doing damage today, responsible for the crisis we have today. And for me, maybe the most mind-bending fact of the entire climate crisis is the simple one that half of all of that damage, half of the carbon that's been put into the atmosphere in the entire history of humanity, stretching back millennia, has been put there just over the last 25 years. So that's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC climate change body, which means we've done more damage knowingly than in ignorance. And it means really that we've engineered this crisis in the lifetimes of those of us in this room today. We're going to do what we can to take hold of it, probably also within the lifetimes of those of us in the world today, which is a very claustrophobic timeline. But I think it also helps to talk about the very present tense with climate. And for me, I think the most important thing there is just that we are living in an unprecedented climate awakening, one that I thought was not thinkable even just a few years ago. I finished my book in the fall of 2018. I had never heard of Greta Thunberg. Nobody had. She was literally a lonely, friendless, awkward teenager sitting outside Swedish Parliament at that point for a couple weeks. And now 3 years later, she is the face of a global political movement much, much bigger than herself. A few years ago, there were denialists in power in political parties all around the world, maybe especially in the US. But they were also, the corporate world, the Davos sphere, was effectively an agency of denial as well. Today, people may just be paying lip service, but almost no one in any position of power anywhere in the world is truly living in denial of climate change. It used to be the case that we talked about reducing emissions. Now we're talking about eliminating them. 3 years ago, we had never heard of the Green New Deal. Now it's not just a major source of inspiration and debate in the US. It's basically the model of all public investment being undertaken by any government anywhere in the world today. And that's happened in 3 years. That is literally unthinkable political progress. And it's made the climate picture look really very different too. A few years ago, 3 years ago, we would have said that business as usual emissions were likely to produce something on the order of 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming. And now most conventional estimates say that we're on track for something like 3, with the possibility that we could be doing still better than that. So in just 3 years, in large part because of the genuinely radical energy of climate activists, maybe embodied in some way by Greta, but much bigger movement than than just her, has cut in half, how much worse climate change could get from here. That's really pretty incredible. But the language of those activists, especially those in the Global South who are speaking really from direct experience, is incredibly urgent, and that urgency has a sort of double meaning, I think, for climate activism, but also considered more generally as a reflection on the state of the global present tense. And that is, if we have to cut our emissions in half in 10 years, we need a revolution. If we need to overturn our energy systems, our transportation systems, our infrastructure, our agriculture in 10 years, that's a revolution. But if we have to do all that in 10 years, we don't have time for a revolution. Both of those things are sort of true at the same time. And now here we are, we're coming out of this big climate conference in Glasgow. And I think on some level I don't want to say we're like getting the worst of both worlds because there has been progress made. But we're sort of making small-scale change without considering replacing the leaders in power. That's sort of the situation we're in. We're neither, if we're neither moving as fast as we would like or making the revolutionary change that would make it would seem to be necessary to make the planet truly livable and comfortable and just for us all. So I think that we have actually sort of danced around the pandemic tonight, which is interesting given it's sort of the prompt of the whole evening. But I think that the lesson of the pandemic itself for climate change is roughly the same, which is to say, we were given an enormous opportunity that we then failed to take. And I think a couple of years in, we often overlook just how radical the transformations in the early stages of the pandemic really were. Within a few months of learning about this disease, we had billions of people sheltering in place all around the world. We had literally more than 1 billion school children away from school. Whole economy shut down, whole social lives shut down, whole romantic lives shut down, out of concern for our fellow humans, those around us. That was that's crazy. That is really, it was beyond what pandemic experts would have said was possible in November of 2019. It's certainly beyond the transformative potential that any climate activists believed was possible at that time. We were thinking we're nudging, maybe ultimately there'll be a big change. But to think we're gonna go from hearing about a disease to totally upending our societies at every level within 3 months was completely unthinkable. But then we didn't do all that much with that capacity to change. It can be inspiring to see how much can change, but we invested something like 3% of COVID relief funds globally on a green transition when governments were literally trying to send money out the door to spend on anything. We could have said, let's spend it on making a happy future. And instead more money was spent subsidizing the fossil fuel business. So we have this sort of I like to think of it as we're sitting in a binocular place where we have to understand just how much change has been signaled is possible and how little we're doing to earn that opportunity and make good on it. And I'm often asked, about climate if there's hope. My first response is, something like, it's not a matter of your mood, whether things are much more complicated than that. But of course, I also ask myself the same question all the time. And I think in the present situation, give it the present tense of climate negotiation and climate action, the answer is, again, it's complicated. It's sort of both at once. The whole effort of climate action since the Paris Accords was to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. I think it's probably time that we gave up publicly on that target, as horrifying as it is, especially for people living in the developing world who are already being pummeled by those impacts. But we've done a lot to lower the ceiling of possible warming too, as I was talking about a few minutes ago. And I think that's probably reason for some small amount of comfort and hope. Although I would say it's also notable that we're likely landing at a temperature level that will, roughly speaking, spare the global north and punish the global south. It's probably no coincidence that that's the likely end game here. But of course, there is, as a few different speakers have mentioned, there is this, there are a few, an additional meaning to the word revolution beyond the sort of immediate political one that comes to mind is just the overturning. And I do think that we are on a trend line now to genuinely overturn all of those things I mentioned that were necessary to overturn our energy systems, our transportation systems, et cetera. If we had 100 years to do it, I'd be feeling really great about where we're heading. And I think we could call that transformation a genuine revolution. I think we'll look back on it as a genuine revolution, but we're probably going to be looking back on it in the year 2100, not the year 2050, which means that we're now in a position where we are genuinely enacting something of radical revolutionary potential, with the possibility of securing a new form of real global shared prosperity, we're just doing it far too slowly. I don't know exactly what to call that, but maybe Renaissance is the word for it. So, thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, now I would like to call all the speakers to occupy chairs. I don't know if we have to do like planes and keep the mask until, no, right? We can, okay, please have a seat. I really like that idea of thinking of the overturning and not just from the political viewpoint. It's really fascinating. But I would like to start by asking Robin a question. Are revolutions always blunt instruments, or can they be also nuanced? Because it's really interesting to see different identities and different tasks.
I believe that they can be very nuanced. They don't always involve the type of spectacular moments that people like to think about. Revolutions can be slow, they can be daily, they can involve transformations that sometimes don't even meet the naked eye. When I think about some of the things that, the revolution in households during the 1960s, for example, and what that meant and what that took just to simply transform those questions of who's going to iron the shirts, right? Who's going to feed the kids? It's an unfinished revolution. We're still in that moment where that the demographics of who does what in the household is still has not transformed much, but there is kind of that kind of evolution.
So it's like a slow revolution in a way. It's also what David was talking about, with over time. Maybe it's a way to also counteract this low violence. I always think of that Rob Nixon definition of the violence that is enacted upon people by the ecological disruptions. But that also goes to what you were saying, Tanya, this idea of the perseverance, of not just one big act, but rather endurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, in our case, it is resistance and understanding revolution as you don't have time to think, basically. I was talking to a friend of mine who was censored in the 60s. His movie was censored, and he's the one who created the moment where Fidel said, within the revolution, everything, without the revolution, no rights, which already was claiming the legality of daring to do something that questioned the revolution. And he was saying that at the beginning of the revolution, the 60s, it was like now, that every day 3, 4, 7 things happen at the same time, and you don't even have time to think. It's ironic because I've been preparing the presentation, and I changed every day the images I was going to use, because every day a new situation appeared until today, and it was so much that I didn't have any images. Because I was keeping changing. I said, I have to go there because I have to talk. So this is interesting that it's so quick that one of the only things you can grab is trusting the person next to you. Because things are changing all the time. The meaning of things are changing all the time. And I also feel that right now, I know it's a painful conversation for a lot of people who believe the Cuban Revolution is useful for them to show how bad all the places are. And I know we have been used that way. We ask, please don't do that anymore. And he listened to the stories of the Cubans. And one thing that has happened is how all the myth of the Cuban Revolution has very quickly shadowed and been destroyed. The myth of Cuban government and revolution not being racist is gone. Our jails have more than 17% Afro-Cuban or black, as we call, prisoners. When you are an activist, I'm not treated the same way my colleagues who are black are treated. And other myths have gone, like, for example, the myth that the Cuban Revolution cared for his people and would never kill anyone. Well, July 11, they had to recognize on national television the police killed one person. I ask, why George Floyd is someone we have to, understand and venerate and can spark a revolution that is needed in this country, and why the people that is being killed in Cuba is not important. Why? Why the life of a black? Because he was black. Hansel was black. There were 3 people actually killed by the police, and the 3 were black. But CNN doesn't talk about it. None of you talk about it. Nobody cares about it. And it's very difficult for us, So we have all these myths that keep coming down and down and down. And the revolution is difficult for us, trying to change, because we have 2 people we are fighting against. All of you, plus the Cuban government. And all of you, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I mean the people who have believed the propaganda, because the Cuban Revolution stopped being a revolution and began to be a propaganda machine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Talking about recognizing what a revolution is or isn't, Paul, what was January 6th?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. January 6th was a very confusing moment, I think. And I think, in part, the people who participated believed that they were the voice of the people. But obviously the people have a lot of different voices. And what strikes me is just the way that party politics manipulates the people in our political system. So it's heartbreaking to watch these people think that they're patriots and speaking in the name of the nation, because they've been sort of led to believe that, without sort of considering that there are thousands, millions of people out there with very different political views. And so it's always dangerous when people take to the streets thinking that they speak for the people.
And is a revolution always about the voice of the people?
Well, I think sometimes they're political and they're cultural revolutions, and political revolutions almost always try to speak in the name of the people. But cultural revolutions sort of go hand in hand with political revolutions. So political revolutions are both political and cultural, but cultural revolutions sometimes take place entirely in a separate sphere from politics, like Robin was talking about. So, and sometimes we don't even recognize cultural revolutions until decades after they happen, but we always recognize political revolutions as they're happening.
Thank you. Anand, you were talking that, you were discussing the fact that we talk too much about the process and not enough about the goal. What is, maybe because it's hard to define the goal, right, sometimes. So what is the goal in your mind right now that we should think of?
There are many, but I think they can be, the various fights people have talked about, I think amount to dignity for people. David's focus is just basically us being able to continue to be alive. That feels foundational. If we can stay alive, maybe some mobility according to people's talents and efforts and dreams. Democracy, being able to choose your government. And I think what's difficult is when the threats are as dire as they are, you have to say all this stuff to convince people of the importance of it. And you end up often depressing people in a way that demobilizes them. Right? It's very, very hard to talk about climate with honesty without making normal people who have difficult lives and work 2 or 3 jobs and have kids that are not listening to them, without making them just say, you know what, I'm just going to watch reality TV. And that's not a stupid response. It's a very understandable response. Or someone can say, okay, gosh, I've totally misunderstood the Cuban Revolution. It's just not worth it. And I think our enemy is apathy. Our enemy is not people necessarily going to the other, becoming January 6th terrorists, but it's just deciding that it's better to pull into private life in a time like this. And I think the challenge is, how do you talk about climate, or how do you talk about changing 400 years of white supremacy in this country in a way that makes people feel actually thrilled to come into the tent that you're inviting them into, that actually makes them feel you're throwing a better party than the other side. And it's very difficult, I think, that challenge of being honest about this moment, about being honest and not sounding like this Cassandra when there's so much to be Cassandra-like about, but galvanizing at the same time and not driving people into the arms of people who are, dangerous and barren, but offer some kind of spark of excitement.
Yeah, very true. So, David, I was listening to the argument, the conversation with the New York Times from last week, and you were with Genevieve Gunter, and she said, she was talking about the importance of converting fear into outrage. And anything you write has a clarity that just cuts to the bone, and it's impossible not to be shocked by your essays and books. So I'm wondering, how do you turn that fear into outrage that then becomes a slow-burning revolution? Have you thought actually of how this can happen, or do you think it's already happening with Greta and the young activists?
In general, I think that a lot of rhetorical questions about the climate movement are somewhat beside the point now that extreme weather itself is doing the propaganda for us.
Like the hailing of yesterday in November, hail, yeah.
I mean, it's even, I was talking a lot about differences from a few years ago, but even 3-4 years ago, people in countries like the US, people across Northern Europe, really could think of climate change as an abstract problem that was not yet alive on the planet. It was not true. There were people all over the world who were suffering, but where we lived, it felt it felt like we were debating in a debate club. And I think that the extreme weather of the last few years, maybe especially the fires, the Pacific heat dome, the flooding across Europe this summer, has really, really changed that and meant that nobody can truly look away anymore. I think people are going to respond to that set of facts in a huge number of idiosyncratic ways and respond to them differently at different times. Sometimes they're going to be outraged, sometimes they're going to be depressed, sometimes they're going to feel optimistic, sometimes they're going to feel apathetic. And my own feeling is that we shouldn't, a political movement that tries to build around a single one of those messages is bound to lose out on a lot of possible adherence. And climate is so important that we need as big a tent as possible, which means we need people who don't want anything to change, but just want the world to be preserved and the promises that we have come to rely on extending to our children and grandchildren to be preserved as well. And then other people who want to actually have a real revolution and decapitate the heads of the fossil fuel companies. We need those people in the movement too. And I think we're as humans, we're incredibly complex people with incredibly complex relationships to our own future. And that anybody who's trying to mobilize on that, should understand that complexity or try to message complexly. And I do think, to Anand's point, I do think that there is a real positive story to tell there. As bleak as I can sound, I didn't even do any of the bleak stuff today, but I promise you, I could depress you all. But it's also the case that 90% of the world's population now lives in places where clean energy is cheaper than dirty, which means that the only thing standing in the way of a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous short-term future, we're talking about in the next 10 years, more prosperous if we go through this transition, the only things standing in that way are political incumbency effects and corporate interests and all that stuff. I mean, it's a familiar list of foes, and they're quite powerful. But if we can imagine getting just over that threshold, we can imagine a future that is richer, more equitable, and healthier. And I think that last thing, not to take too much time, but is really, really quite important and powerful. 10 million people are dying every year from air pollution, 8.7 million of them from the burning of fossil fuels, 10 million people a year. So I'm 39 years old. That means that in my lifetime, 400 million people have died from air pollution. That is, on the one hand, it's an incredible humanitarian catastrophe. It's a moral outrage. it's an indictment of our apathy that we don't see that as a problem. But it also, the math just tells you, if we draw down our use of fossil fuels, those lives will be saved. Maybe even in short order, all of them. And what a humanitarian boon that would be. We're going to get there. The question is how fast. And it's up to all of us to, try to accelerate that transition to that happier, cleaner, more prosperous future more quickly. But we actually are heading in the right direction. There is a good news story there too.
Yeah, that's good. Before I turn to you, there's like 2 questions that I feel are necessary. The first is the role of the artist in the revolution, in the taming of the revolution, in the dismantling of the trademark.
No, I think in Cuba the arts have had a very important role. I think we were rehearsing the revolution through our artwork, and we were also giving the audience, the people who came to our exhibitions, who saw on the internet the performances, some tools they could use later if they wanted, and they did on July 11. We also did something, and I'm sorry to pride, but I'm very proud of it. On 27th of November next year, more than 500 artists gather in front of the Ministry of Culture to ask to talk to a minister who, of course, never came for conversation. And because we wanted to demand the freedom of some of our friends who were artists in prison, but also to have the right to have political rights. It was very interesting because we started our manifesto, whatever we did there, and it was very emotional, all these people, and even people who never came to anything political, like were like kind of timid, they came and we saw, then we had singings and we have poems, and it was so beautiful. Something very interesting happened. Mothers were coming with their kids. I mean, their kids were 40 years old too, and some of the kids were like 19, 20. And I asked one of the mom, why are you here? And she's like, well, I want to make sure nothing happens to my kid. And it was a very beautiful multi-generational event. And we started for 1 year asking for dialogue with the government to see if we can talk to them about things we wanted to change, and in a peaceful way. We are a peaceful movement, and we try everything. We wrote letters, we stand in front of them, and the response we had was defamation. They put our personal telephone numbers on national TV, so people call us to offend us. They put some of our telephone numbers in the website where people buy stuff, saying that we were selling cigars, or we were selling telephones, or whatever it was in need at the moment. So we received hundreds of people calling. Oh, are you selling, like, I don't know, ham? No,
it's
I'm not
almost
selling
juvenile.
ham. Yeah. Well, yeah, the Cuban, unfortunately, they're very powerful, but they behave like bad boys with stupid taste. So basically, the response to all of this that was peaceful, we were so naive. I have to say we were very naive. We grew in a year very quickly because was that some of our friends were going again, because it's very funny. They never want to meet with us, but as soon as we said we're going to demonstrate in the street, the Vice Minister of Culture called one of us and say, hey, can you meet tomorrow at the same time that we were supposed to go out to demonstrate? And we always say yes, and we always stop our demonstration because we prefer to talk to them. And in January 27, the Minister of Culture himself came out and slapped an artist to take his phone, because he said, here's the Minister of Culture, we want to talk to him. And he took the phone, and that gesture was actually an order to a group of police that was around, and through that gesture, so they, oh, this is okay, and they came and grabbed all these artists. And the sound, I didn't want to bring it today, the sound is horrific, of the scream of my friends, because they were taken and beaten.
This is what just happened.
This
'Cause
happened.
You're basically in exile here. This is something we have not said, but you left the country so that some people could be freed from prison, and you can't go back.
Well, I am trying to be a smartass, so I never said I never come back. I say I'm leaving, which of course means forever, but I never say forever.
Never.
So I like semantics very much. So, but the thing is, right now the Cuban government is exiling, which is actually a colonial. They have taken a colonial concept used by the Spanish conquistadores and to el destierro, which is to take you out of the country forever. And basically what the government is doing is forcing, bringing people to very inhuman feelings and their family. I have one person who worked with me that the mom begged me to talk to her so she leaves because all the family was so worried about her. And basically that's what they're doing. When they have a problem, they want people to leave instead of solving the problem.
Oh.
And they don't want us to come back.
Thank you. I have 2 more questions, but maybe, does anybody have an urgent question? Yeah, there you go with the hat. You know, I don't know what the regulations are right now. If you want, you can scream your question.
I'm very loud.
Aha, you're very loud. Good for you. Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Constance Patton. Hi.
Constance Patton.
Constance with a K. You can Google me.
Yeah.
See some of the work I'm doing. These are my friends here, and we're street artists. So I have a collective called Salon Renaissance Factory, and we were born out of the protests. I guess it's more of a comment and then a question. So after George Floyd was killed, and I'll say her name, Breonna Taylor, many, many artists showed up. I don't know who was aware of it because everybody was inside during that time. So we organized together after seeing the complete downtown Soho shut down, boarded up. It was apocalyptic, and we started to organize.
Why don't you give her a mic?
I don't know. Is there a roving mic? Yeah. You want to use this? Yeah. I don't know if the light can go there. We're not that organized.
Hello. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So I just wanted to acknowledge. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody here. Like, thanks for your time. I just wanted to acknowledge the revolution and the Renaissance that's happening right now underneath our noses, right? Because we have been inside, and just like me and my friend, my 2 friends right here, Aaron Coe and Ohio Mike, Aaron actually put up a lot of street art that was about the climate change, you know, so we had things like George Floyd, yes, but it wasn't just limited to that. That was just the catalyst that got us out of the house. That's when I came out of the house after, I never felt so black until this year. Like, I know I'm black, yeah, but you know, the way I was treated on my way in here today, 3 times before we got here. And I just want to say, like, this is really great. Like, it's cool we're having these conversations. I'm happy to be here, but we have to also think about the young people, the young artists. Like, you know, you're showing pictures of the protests, and there was none of the art. There were hundreds of works made. There's documentaries about the work. Erin was on the freaking New York Times with her work about climate change. So I just want to bring attention to that. I'd encourage anybody here to take a little Google, Soho Renaissance Factory or whatever, just apply with art and the pieces that are going up, and you know, the artists that are organizing now, we've created residencies. We actually painted onto the MoMA design store, and they destroyed our work.
No, we didn't.
I have it, yeah, and Soho,
sorry.
and so that, yeah, I mean, thanks for the apology. My colleague Amir Diop, we painted we did street museums. If you were walking around, you saw our work.
Constance, I have to ask you to bring it to an end because I want to.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up, but I just want to say, I want to bring that to your attention because it shows that there is a disconnect between what's happening on the street, so we could talk about revolution, but we're missing out if we're not talking about like what's actually happening right now.
Thank you.
You know?
No, it's true. See, what happens in these salons is that we can never be comprehensive, but your contribution is really good, because what we do is we seed more questions than we answer. So thank you. And thank you, Erin. Yes. Anybody that has another question? Otherwise, I'm gonna ask my own then. I didn't see anybody. Okay. So Paul, I wanted to ask you, we spoke about the artists inside the revolution. I would like to ask you about the art outside the revolution. So we talked before about the depiction of the revolution and how it changes over time. How have revolutions been memorialized in your mind? Can you give some examples? Also, we didn't talk about many other revolutions trademarked, like the Chinese Revolution, etc.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing is that revolutions create their own mythology, and that's sort of what Tanya was talking about, that, you're in a revolution, and then all of a sudden the revolution is in the past and begins this sort of almost propaganda machine legitimizing itself because revolutionaries want to stay in power. And after a period of time, a revolution is no longer revolutionary. It's the status quo. And I mean, I was sort of very struck by Tanya's speech in the sense that she sort of, if you compare yourself to the so-called Cuban revolutionaries, you people seem more revolutionary than the people in power who, as you said, aren't really revolutionary anymore. So I think so much of the art that is generated by revolutions are sort of, and many of the pictures that I put up there are sort of part of the propaganda effort to keep the revolution going. And when I was in college, I studied in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, right before it fell, and I was just amazed by all the art everywhere that were depicting events from 70 years before, and everything felt so stuck, like it was never going to change. And I think everybody was shocked that it just all fell apart just a few years later.
Can I say one thing very quickly?
Yes, sure. Sorry,
One thing happened in Cuba recently that was quite significant to what you say. The people who protest against the revolution, let's say, they're always being called from the right wing and all of that, Miami. Now we have a leftist movement, even Marxist, who are analyzing how the revolution is not anymore socialist, but it is neoliberal and actually capitalist of a state. They call it the military capitalism of a state. And when there was this person called Leonardo and Fernandez, and he went in the street with a banner, whatever piece of cardboard, say, socialism, yes, repression, no. He was detained. He was expelled from the university. He was isolated from all his friends. And in the national TV, they say, we are very worried because there is a radical leftism right now in Cuba that wants to destroy the revolution. So just to show you how things change.
It's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Who has the microphone? Go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
So my name is Mirna Giordano, and I come from Yugoslavia. That was not the Soviet Union. But I left Sarajevo in 1995 through the underground tunnel because it was a city that was shelled and bombed by another revolutionaries. My grandpa was a partisan that fought fascists in ex-Yugoslavia. I currently work as a physician, as a pediatrician at Columbia University. And about 80% of kids that I treat sign that they have food insecurity. So the question I have for all of you is, why are we not outraged? You talked about Paola, fear being turned into outrage. Yeah. We have all of you talking about climate, racism. Why are we not more outraged?
I am very outraged, I'm sorry.
No. Does anybody want to take this hand? Do you want to take it, Robin?
One thing I'll say, and I am outraged about food insecurity. The college that I work at, Lehman College, so many of the students are struggling with food insecurity. One of the things I wanted to say is that when we think about food insecurity, different things come to mind, right? I think that what has happened is that ideology shapes what we see. So when we see someone with the need for food, and we saw that during the pandemic, where we saw the long lines of people at the food banks, and that just was what was visible. Beyond that was a historic hunger in this country that had been, I wouldn't say unaddressed, because there's so many organizations that are dedicated to making change in that way, but it was not hyper visible in the same way. When we see someone who's hungry, we see them through ideology that blames them for their condition, right? That is why the outrage is muted, because our understanding of why people are struggling, why people are poor, are predicated upon who they are, what we think is deficit in them, their culture, their family, their background, etc. So instead of becoming something that has to do with us, it becomes that person is deficient. That is the ideology that I think governs. That is why, if you've ever has spoken with a child, and I'll say that I remember leaving here in New York and taking my daughter to San Francisco, there where she saw the level of houselessness that was just, for like a 4 or 5 year old, and then looking twice at people, eating from the trash cans and all of this kind of thing. And it's a shock. But what happens to us, the reason why we step over people and keep moving, is because we believe that they're somehow, they belong there, they deserve that, they made a choice, they're on drugs, their family, their background, it's not about us, we shouldn't get involved. I think that is why the outrage is not higher than it is. The pandemic brought food insecurity in this country to everybody's screens. In a way, it made people understand that, wow, lots of people are hungry in the United States of America. Many organizations and people had known that beforehand. So hunger, addressing hunger, and like I said about the Black Panthers, asking the question, why can't this country feed its people, is a question. And I think the pandemic really raised that in new ways.
I think that, and I think that, it's really interesting to think about that dynamic locally as being, we blame the people who are suffering. I think it's also, on some level, it's even easier for us to look away from suffering elsewhere in the world when it's more distant. And we don't do that by pointing the finger at individuals and saying, like, you are to blame for your poverty, but we do, I think we've been taught to see their suffering as nevertheless natural, and therefore not really our fault or our problem. And that's quite horrific. I think of it, primarily in terms of climate, where the climate crisis is the result of the damage that people in the rich countries of the world have done, and it will be the poor people in the world who suffer by far the most. But it's true in every way. When people in the West look at poor people elsewhere in the world, they don't think this is an indictment of how I live, by and large. They think, oh, what a tragedy. And then they turn the channel and don't donate money to the little infomercial that they saw, and don't take seriously the moral obligation of the moral demands of what it means for people to really be suffering. And I think that you mentioned ideology. I think the ideology goes even deeper than personal responsibility, where we are really almost taught to believe that many people in the world sort of should suffer and maybe feel better about our own success and comfort as a result of that, because we get to think of that as natural too.
I always hope that art and artists can help visualize and really impress all of these truths upon people. Erin, or maybe I'm going to go there and then come to you. So, yeah, to the lady over there, and then we'll come to Erin. Okay, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Janet Wong. I work in the arts, performing arts. I own some of your books, actually. I want to go back to, Paola, you mentioned early on, during your introduction, you said, and then there's money, capitalism.
Yeah, we haven't talked about much about that. It's funny.
I would love to hear some of you talk about, are we just putting Band-Aids on a system that is just governed by capitalism? I don't know if anyone's familiar with Mark Fisher. He's like a he's a kind of philosopher, a culture observer, and he killed himself a few years ago. And he said that we have, since the 1980s, Reagan and Thatcher, we've given up on ever finding an alternative to capitalism. So anyway, so I would love to hear you talk about
I was thinking
money.
about it. We spoke about the revolution and not about the Renaissance between quotes. So Anand, do you want to talk about this more?
I mean, I think it threads through every single issue that everybody has raised. I think it is the elephant in the room in so many of these conversations, but I will say that I think we are talking about it now explicitly in so many public conversations in a way that I don't remember in my lifetime. I mean, it has always been, at least since that era, the dawn of that era, the thing behind all the other things. But it was not an explicit conversation in many ways. We talk about the deficit. What should we do about the deficit? And these like proxy things. And today, I mean, certainly young people, and the Gen Z is amazing on this, just like actually frontally going to those root issues as their kind of instinct and orientation. But the Democratic primary in 2020 was really about capitalism. I mean, it wasn't in the prior year such an open argument about where do you stand on capitalism. In many ways, there have been weird but important movements on the right that are questioning, the kind of small, like business class Republican Party, and there's debate there. I think we're facing it. I think the problem is the capitalism conversation, sort of like your ideas, becomes misused by all kinds of people. And the reality is, within a lot of societies that have capitalism, there are greater and less levels of dignity, of healthcare, of redistribution of wealth, of ownership of resources. And so when we get into an all or nothing debate, I fear that it serves the right, actually, because then it gets into this place of either it's exactly like this or there's nothing, or there's gulags. And in fact, there's a lot of variety in how people involve the market, the public sector, civil society. And I think we have to have a more nuanced conversation about what is the proper place of the market in a world in which it does not own the society. It's just one organ in that society.
You're right about Gen Z. They go for the jugular. May the heavens bless them. So Erin now.
Sorry, we have a question actually from the Time Warner Theater, one of the viewers in.
Okay. Yeah, we need to give a little to our overflow room. Yes, please.
It's to the whole panel. My name is Aya. I'm a technologist and social activist from Lebanon. My question is. My question is, can you point me to a playbook of how to make a political revolution succeed? I have been involved in the Lebanese revolution for 2 years and had a front row seat to the Palestinian revolution and so many others in the Arab world. And I'm wondering, is there a playbook we can follow to get to success?
Yeah, who wants to take this? Playbook for success in the revolution. It's the historians here. Robin and Paul, please. No, you don't want it. You don't want it. Then Paul. Robin. No, seriously. I know she's been. The Lebanese people have been blown apart by the blast, and the political system, and they were hoping in the tragedy to use that crisis to change things, and it seems not to be working. And so I know it's a big dilemma.
I think it's a frustration that we all feel about everything, whether it's food insecurity or racism or climate change, just not knowing what to do, that we feel powerless and feel that our choices are constrained. And it's either you take to the streets or you try to elect somebody who is going to do something differently. But
it doesn't seem to work.
No, it never seems to work. And I actually live in Maine, and my senator is Susan Collins, and she's like always saying, I want to hear from the people of Maine. Well, I keep talking to her, but she's not listening. I must send her emails like every week, and I get back, solicitations for money, but it's just so frustrating. You don't know how to change things. I mean, David, you must deal with people all the time who want to change the world and feel frustrated. What are is it just the youth taken to the streets? Is there some playbook?
Yeah, I mean, I really do take a lot of heart and inspiration from the youth climate strikers. I mean, I mentioned them earlier, but Greta's in a lot of ways sort of miscast leader. This is a movement that is populated largely by everybody's under the age of 20 or whatever. There are many of them living in countries where nobody votes. There's no democracy, but even in those places where they do have the vote, these are people who don't have the vote. They're overwhelmingly female, many ethnic minorities, many queer and trans. These are people who basically, across the developing world, who could not be farther from the centers of political power than they couldn't be any farther. And certainly, they would laugh at us if sitting up here. They heard us saying we feel powerless. Although I do feel powerless, but they would laugh at us because everybody in this room is much closer to the centers of political power than many of these climate strikers are. And they looked at the same bargain where they saw the problem was so big and I feel so small. And they just said, I refuse to accept that deal. And they started protesting and agitating in their own countries. And over the course of a couple of years, which in political terms is a remarkably short amount of time, they really have changed the whole landscape on climate change and what can be done and what world leaders feel obligated to do. Now, it's inadequate. That change is not going to bring about the goals that those climate strikers have or the scientists in whose name they're speaking. We're not moving nearly fast enough. The system is lurching in one direction, but it's not, not moving quickly enough. Nevertheless, it's hard to look at how different the world seems now than it seemed in 2017 or 2012 on climate and not call it a revolution. And I think that it's those climate strikers who are really to credit for that transformation, which, I also, these terms are so complicated, but, I think it that no revolution has ended in a perfect success story doesn't mean that no revolution has succeeded. And the one that we're living through now may feel incredibly difficult and on many different fronts. That doesn't mean that successes, small-scale successes, as Robin was talking about, are not possible. And this may seem really parochial and off-topic, but I think about this all the time. My mom started this sort of radical public school in East Harlem, where I went, called Central Park East in the 70s, and it was all these hugely ambitious educating for democracy goals, open classroom, project-based learning, et cetera, but also is incredibly ethnically diverse, economically diverse. And all those teachers now, they're 40, 50 years later, they're all like, oh, we failed totally. And I'm like, no, all schools now involve all of those lessons. You don't see that you succeeded in seeding this entirely new educational pedagogical ideology throughout the entire American public education system. And they're like, no, we failed. And I do think that there's, I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, these are all hugely difficult subjects and we're not making nearly enough progress on any of them. But I also think it's hard when you're fighting for that progress to really see progress, to see the victories that you've won. And I think personally, when I look at climate, I'm like, the fact that we're heading for a 3-degree world instead of a 5-degree world is a huge victory. And I want to thank all of the climate strikers for enacting that revolution, even if they are looking at the same facts and saying we're failing.
Maybe the secret is not the secret to you, Aya and Hezbollah. I think that's a difficult issue, but in general, we should stop having revolutions with the capital R and instead having revolution with the small r and keep them going. The moment they become establishment, we move them like we do with Earth, in a way. I should stop, but okay, I'm gonna give it to you one last, and then. But I want to tell you, those of you that are not able to ask a question tonight, you have our email, so send it to us, and we'll follow through. Please.
My name is Eileen Cohn, and I work in the arts as well. And my question has to do not so much with revolution, but also with regression. The regression that we're living now, the revolutions that were fought and won, and women's sovereignty over their bodies, like you're saying in Cuba, Venezuela, all these things, like we talked about, you were talking about not just picturing the future, but it almost feels to me like we almost need to really come together and figure out a plan to stop all the regression, like all the, the Capitol Hill, who would have thought that could be possible, I ask that to anybody who can.
Who wants to answer this?
I'll just say one thing about that, which is I think it's we are living through a huge movement for regression that wants regression. But I think it's important to understand, at least the way I can get some rest at night, is to understand it as a movement of backlash, not a frontlash, whatever that is. It's possible to imagine something like Trumpism or something like that that would really be a movement of the future. Maybe the revolution you write about, had that whiff of the future and the whiff of a building. This doesn't feel like that. It feels like a mourning, and they are mourning with a U. It feels like people clinging. It feels like the last vestiges of something. So I think of all of that as a revolt against a future, and a future that is quite clearly coming. The demographics of this country are quite clearly changing, whether these people like it or not. I was just in the state of Arizona. Arizona has the biggest spread between the racial makeup of people dying every year and the racial makeup of the people being born today. Donald Trump can't stop that. The phony audit can't stop that. Arizona is changing, and young people in Arizona don't mind. They just live in it. And this is a movement that wants to stop the future, that wants women to go back to the days in which there was no sovereignty over their body, et cetera, et cetera. But when we don't remember that the reason they're revolting is because actually quite a bit of track has been laid for the future, to your point about climate, like there actually have been victories. Women's status did hugely change over the last 50 years. Our progress in understanding our history is actually, we've made tremendous, we're not all the way there, but I think sometimes we don't tell the story of the fact that we are falling on our face because we're jumping high right now. We're actually attempting to do big things, to live in truth as a country in a way we haven't in the past, to change the status of all kinds of people. And there is some minority faction of people who is going to try to revolt against the future. And I think we just have to insist that the future prevails and that they are a faction who will be banished over time by history.
Revolt against the future. That's the new book. Yay! No. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I really want to thank you. You've been wonderful, and I wish I could give you some bad wine and bad snacks. I mean, really, but we'll get there. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to everybody that was in the overflow room, and to be continued soon. Thanks a lot, and thanks also to Helena Clevorn. She's the new R&D fellow. Well, you get to know her. Yay!